Yeah, I see. We are at about 20 attendees right now and going up. So we'll wait a couple of minutes maybe or before the webinar starts. Hello, my name is Marcus Broer, and I'm currently the chair of the NAEP Studies SIG. And as we wait a few minutes before the presentation starts, I just would like to say a few words of gratitude. First, I want to thank all of the panelists for agreeing to be on the webinar during this holiday season, and of course also to all the participants joining today. I'm also very pleased that this webinar represents a cross-SIG collaboration and that we are joined today by colleagues from the Social Studies Research SIG. And finally, I want to thank everybody from the NAEP Studies leadership team involved in planning for this webinar, especially Judy Tang and my colleague Jasmine Park, who organized today's webinar. Jasmine is a senior researcher at AER and co-program chair of the NAEP Studies SIG since 2021, and she's been involved with NAEP research since she joined AER in 2013. Before turning over to Jasmine, I also have some brief asks from the NAEP Studies SIG, if you allow. First one, if you aren't a NAEP SIG member yet, please consider joining the SIG as you renew your AERA membership for 2024. Also, please consider joining us for a business meeting at AERA in April. Finally, I would like to encourage researchers working with NAEP data to submit their work for the consideration for the NAEP Outstanding Publication Award next year. Thank you. Turning over to Jasmine.
Thank you, Marcus. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on your location. As Marcus said, I'm Jasmine Park, and I have been coordinating the webinar series for the past couple of years, and I'm delighted to see so many of you joining us today. And before we dive into the presentation, I want to inform you that the webinar is being recorded. The recording link will be available on the NAEP Studies SIG YouTube channel. Believe it or not, we do have a YouTube channel. And the link will be shared with all NAEP SIG members and everyone who registered for today's webinar. We have outstanding group of experts with us today, and I really appreciate our presenters for taking the time to join us. First on the agenda is Ebony Walton, a statistician from the National Center for Education Statistics in the U.S. Department of Education, joined by Grady Wilburn, also a statistician at NCS, who leads several activities for NAEP, including the communication and dissemination of results, and also researching performance in lower performing and underrepresented student groups. Next, Saki Koma, a senior researcher at AER, will present findings from a study conducted with Corey Savage, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. Following that, Madeline Goodman, a senior program management lead at Educational Testing Service, will share her work related to NAEP social studies data. And Erin Adams, an associate professor at Kansas State University and also chair for the AER Social Studies SIG, will be our next presenter. Finally, Laura Hamilton, a senior director at the Center on Advancing Measurement and Assessment within AER, will share her insights and moderate a discussion and Q&A with the presenters. So if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A feature. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Grady and Ebony.
Thank you, Jasmine. Good morning or afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Please let me know if you cannot see it. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start with discussing some of the more recent NAEP results. I'm going to do U.S. history, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ebony, to go through civics. So these data were collected at the beginning of 2022 between January and March. It's national only, so no state or district level data, and it was only 8th graders. So again, beginning with U.S. history. Hopefully you can see my screen. Let me make it a little bigger in case it's too small. We saw declines when you compare the results from the previous data collection in 2018, which was notably pre-massive school closures. And so, when we see the results pre-school closures versus post-school closures, so far we've seen nothing but declines, and the U.S. history is nothing different. But we also want to point out that when you look at 2014 and 2018, that we were seeing declines already. So these declines were happening before COVID. So I don't think it's fair to say that all these declines occurred because of COVID, but I'm sure some of it is related to that. Again, I'm using the nationsreportcard.gov page. I should have mentioned that at the outset, the highlights page, which we put a lot of thought into organizing the most important results. So please feel free to go to the Nations Report Card and look at the highlights page for what I'm sharing here. U.S. history has 4 themes: change in community and American democracy, which we have labeled democracy; the gathering and interactions of peoples, cultures, and ideas, which we have labeled culture; and economic and technological changes in their relationship to society, ideas, and environment, which we call technology; and then finally, the changing role of America in the world, which we short have called world role. Those 4 subscales, regardless of them, have all declined when you compare the 2022 results to the previous results in 2018, as indicated by those asterisks. As you also see, several of these scores, democracy and culture, those subscales are higher, are lower now than they were at the very beginning for democracy and culture versus but that's also the same for technology. Whereas world role, we actually have seen an increase over time for that subscale when you compare to the very first administration. As I scroll down the page, we have been often looking at percentile performance to better understand how the whole distribution of students perform, not just that average score. And what we've seen across many assessments, but especially here in U.S. history, is that all groups seem to be dropping, except in this instance, the highest performing. And so we call our higher performing students 90th and 75th percentile. And you see that the 70th, 75th has dropped, but the 90th, those highest performing students, have maintained their performance to their previous assessment. When you look at the 25th and the 10th percentile, you see those declines occurring from 2018 to 2022, as well as 2014 to 2018. So back-to-back drops for most of the distribution, except for those highest performing students. As we scroll down, we look at achievement levels, again, to better understand where performance is. These asterisks indicate that the number in 2022 is significantly different from that 2018 number. And so we have seen the group that is below NAEP Basic has increased from 34% to 40%. And that group that is at NAEP Basic has also decreased from 50% to 46%. And you don't see too much of a change when you look at or above proficient, but that 2-point difference between 2018 and 2022, that 15% to 13% does represent a significant drop in those at or above proficient on NAEP. I don't think we have time for questions, but I do want to point out that by the different achievement levels on this highlights page, we do have an example of some questions and a skill assessed, as well as how that looks across the achievement level. So I do encourage you to explore that a little bit further. When you look at drops within student groups, starting with gender, you see that again, compared to 2022, we are seeing some drops for both male and females. When you look at race ethnicity, if it comes up, we're seeing compared to 2018, the 2022 score is lower for both Black, Hispanic, students of 2 or more races, and white students. And I should point that some of these drops where you're seeing these diamonds, they weren't significant, but they were pretty large numerically. We just didn't pick up significance. So while it's not statistically significant, there probably was something going on there with other groups as well. And then finally, before I turn it over to Ebony, we have a host of questions that we ask both students and we ask teachers. This particular question asks 8th graders whether they've taken a class or a course about U.S. history in 8th grade. As you see, 68% of 8th graders say they have or are currently taking a class mainly focused on U.S. history. That has actually dropped compared to 2018, where it was 72%. And what you're also seeing is this group here who have reported taking a class mainly focused in U.S. history in 8th grade, and their performance has also dropped from 2018 to 22. So there's less students taking a class in 8th grade, and those students who are taking a class, their performance has dropped. And then finally, we ask teachers, is teaching U.S. history, your primary responsibility, and we see that 55% of the teachers that we surveyed did indicate this was the case. This is a lower percentage than we reported in 2018. And you see that students who have teachers that do report teaching history as their primary responsibility, they do perform better than students who have teachers that don't report teaching U.S. history as their main responsibility. So that's my brief overview of U.S. history. Now I'm going to stop sharing and let Ebony share the civics results with you all.
All right, thank you so much, Grady, and thank you everyone for joining this session. Do you see the civics page? Great. Okay, so I'm basically going to go through similar results as Grady showed for U.S. history, but you will see some differences in the score changes. So I do want to point out some of those differences. On average, we did register a significant score decline from 2018 to 2022 in grade 8 civics. This is the first time we recorded any change from assessment to assessment. Over the long term, there weren't any significant changes on average. This was the first time where we did see a change in average scores, and unfortunately, it was a score decline. Unlike U.S. history, civics, we don't report out in subscales, but I do want to talk about the content in general. We are asking students about their knowledge of the foundations of the American political system. We're asking about their knowledge about civic life and politics and the roles of U.S. citizens. We're also asking about how the United States relates to other countries around the world. So this content really is focused on United States democracy, United States Constitution and laws, and how we as U.S. citizens conduct ourselves given all of these principles and our history. So a lot of this content overlaps with, not a lot, but there is some overlap in the concepts that Grady mentioned with the U.S. history subscales. But this is a very focused content area around American democracy and our foundations of our political system that we have. So that being said, I'm going to go through the same kind of layout here. So on average, we saw the significant score change, and where we're seeing the score declines occur in a performance distribution are for our lower and middle performing students. There was no significant change for students performing at the 75th and 90th percentile. So again, pretty much a 3-point change for the middle and lower performing students. Looking at the results by achievement level, we're recording around a third, 31% or so of our students who do not reach the NAEP basic range in civics. On the other hand, we're looking at around 22% of the students, about a fifth or so, who scored at or above NAEP proficient in U.S. civics. That percentage of students who reached the NAEP proficient range really hasn't changed over time. On the other hand, though, we do see an increase in students not being able to reach the NAEP basic level. Now, when you go to our website, you can do some digging into what does it mean to be proficient or basic. And so I just wanted to point out, we do give these little descriptions here about some of the skills that students must demonstrate at these levels. I think that part is very important because these assessments and this content is very unique. It's not something that you see assessed congruently across the states. It's not like math or reading where people have a general sense of what students should do. So I do recommend that you dig into what it means to be scoring at the advanced level, the skills that we're assessing students to reach those benchmarks. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting. So we're seeing significant score declines both for male and female students in civics. But when you look by race ethnicity, you see a whole bunch of diamonds, meaning no significant change by race, which is kind of weird. And it's one of those weird things that happens with our national only assessments. These sample sizes are much smaller than our state, when we have state intuitive data collections, like we do with grades 4 and 8 math and reading. And so in this case, we weren't detecting significant changes on average by race. But if you click here, average score, you can kind of get an indication of how the scores are trending. And I want to particularly point out the white score here, 162 to 159. If you recall back to our average score change, it was -3 points, -3 points for a large student group. And the reason why this wasn't marked as significant wasn't because it didn't meet our significance threshold. In this case, it did. In this case, it's one of those funky things where when you include the family size adjustment, it took away that significance marker. So take that for what it's worth. On average, for the whole nation, we are saying that there was a significant decline. In this case, white students, depending on how you do your significance test, could have had a significant decline, but as we reported, there was no change on average. I also want to bring up this point because this reminds me of the grade 8 reading results, where on average we saw no change for any racial ethnic group except for white students. And I just wanted to kind of bring that out. It just ran a parallel to results that we saw in the same assessment window. Okay, let's see here. Performance trends, okay. And this dropdown also gives results for other groups as well, including location. No significant change on average, but again, when you kind of look at the scores, suburb is trending down, etc., you can kind of see those results there. Getting into some of the contextual results really quickly, about half of 8th graders reported taking a class mainly focused in civics. And that percentage didn't change from 2018. We also see that 29% of students had a teacher whose primary responsibility was teaching civics. And the last thing that I'm going to point out is not related to this, but it's in our report card, is that we reported results by students' confidence levels in being able to complete civics-related tasks. And those results showed that the scores declined only for students who reported low levels of confidence. Those who had medium and high levels of confidence, their scores actually held steady. And so, we've seen some interesting findings regarding how students' self-reporting of their confidence relates to their performance. So I just wanted to point that out there as well. And I'll go ahead and turn this back to Jasmine, I believe, who will bring it to our next presenter, or if we'll have questions, but that's where I end here.
Oh, sure. Saki, as you are getting ready for sharing your slides, Ebony and Grady, we do have a question. Do you want to take that question? So we have a question about differences across school types and whether the restrict use data for 2022 social studies are available.
So school types, I don't know if you mean like public versus private, or if you mean like the school location. I can say that for 2022, we didn't have reportable results for private schools or Catholic schools. So if that's your question, we don't have the comparison there. As far as the restricted use data, we are in the process of getting those data ready. It does take a little bit of a while, especially considering all the reports that we had kind of in the queue in early 2022. But I would ask that you subscribe to the if you look at restricted use data on NAEP at the website, there's something to subscribe to so you know when it's available, or you can just hound Ebony or myself and we can make sure that we let you know when it's available.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Okay, I will share my screen. Can you see my screen? Okay, good. Hi, my name is Saki Ikoma, a senior researcher at AERA. I greatly appreciate this opportunity to talk about our study, Access to Civics Content and Evidence-Based Instructional Approaches in U.S. Schools. It is unfortunate that, as Jasmine told, the co-author Corey Savage cannot join this webinar today. But given the limited time, I will focus on very high-level overview. If you would like to know further details or have any questions about study, we can check out our website. I believe, Jasmine, you can post the link, or feel free to email us. Both Corey and I are happy to make it conversational and contribute to the ongoing discussions regarding NAEP as well as social studies. All right, let me explain the significance of this study first. Then I will introduce research questions, data, variables, and methods for us to dive into the results and implications. Civic education in this globalized world is more critical than ever for students to participate in their democracy. However, recent evidence on access to civic learning opportunities, especially at the national level, is limited. Also, understanding and monitoring such access or opportunity is crucial to address policy implications, especially for informing where resources should be directed. The NAEP Civics Assessment has been administered every 4 years. The latest NAEP Civics Assessment, the data is available, was 2018, which allows to fill the gap of literature. Therefore, our study aimed to describe the national landscape of access to civic learning opportunities for grade 8 students. We built on prior research on access to civic learning opportunities and conducted this study to answer the following 2 research questions. First, to what extent does access to civics content and evidence-based instructional approaches vary within school and between schools across the U.S.? And second, to what extent do the characteristics of students, schools, and states explain variation in access? So we used the 2018 NAEP Civics Assessment, which was the first administration of NAEP Civics since the most recent reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act at the end of 2015. We limited the sample to students who took a course that covered civics or U.S. government topics in grade 8. We excluded the student who did not take such a course or did not remember if they took such a course, which resulted in a sample of approximately 10,100 students in 590 traditional public schools, 50 charter schools, and 130 private schools. We looked at 3 outcome measures for civics content. Students reported how often the following learning opportunities occurred during the school year. First one is politics and government, including 6 NAEP items focused on the national U.S. Constitution, the 3 branches of the U.S. government, how laws are made, political parties, elections and voting, current political social issues, and the role and responsibility of local, state, national governments in the United States. Alpha coefficient was 0.82. The second one is citizenship, including 3 NAEP items focused on the rights and responsibilities of U.S. citizens, why it is important to pay attention to the political process in government, and why it is important for individuals to participate in the political process in government. Alpha coefficient was 0.84. Third one is international affairs, including 3 NAEP items focused on other countries' government, international organizations, and how the United States influences and is influenced by events in other countries. Alpha coefficient was 0.69. Based on our literature review, we also looked at 4 NAEP items for instructional approaches that are written opinion, writing long responses, political debates and discussions, and civics-oriented field trips. Predictors. For student characteristics, predictors were students' race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, English learner status, and disability status. School characteristics included school type and location. State characteristics included census region and state testing policy. The state testing policy is a dummy coding variable on whether the state requires a test in social studies subjects, which we obtained from the NCS State Education Practices on the NCS website. First research question was to what extent access varies within schools and between schools across the US. To answer the question, we estimated intra-class correlation for each measure of opportunity in order to understand the variation within and between schools. Second research question was to what extent the characteristics of students, schools, and states explain variation in access. In order to answer that question, we regressed each measure of opportunity on each predictor separately in order to describe access by various characteristics. When we conducted the regression analysis, we controlled for 8th grade course type, that is either a course focused mainly on civics or including some civics. Finally, we used the sampling weights and jackknife procedure to obtain unbiased estimates and standard errors. Now we are moving on to the results we found. We would expect most of the variation in opportunity to occur between schools. However, we found there is considerable variation within schools on all investigate measures of civic content and instructional approaches, given most ICCs ranged from 0.10 to 0.14. We also found politics and government content varied relatively more between schools than other measures of opportunity, with its ICC about 0.30. Moving on to the second research question for student characteristics. We found that Black and Hispanic students generally reported greater access or opportunity than their white peers. Results for Asian students were mixed. In terms of student SES, where we found measurable differences, those differences suggest access or opportunity favored students of relatively lower SES. Meanwhile, students with disability reported significantly greater access or opportunity than students without disabilities on all measures except politics and government. English learners reported greater access than non-EL students across all measures. Now let's look at the variation in access by school characteristics. Including marginally significant differences, charter school students reported greater access to the majority of learning opportunities when we compared to traditional public school students. Meanwhile, private school students reported less access to learning about politics and government, but more opportunities for civic-oriented field trips. We also found that access varied by school location as well. Students in city school, for example, reported significantly greater access or opportunity than students in rural and suburban schools across all measures. In terms of civic-oriented field trips, we found that students in rural schools reported significantly less opportunity than students in city and town schools. Finally, let's take a look at the variation in access by state characteristics. Even when controlling for the course type, as I explained, access also varied by census region. For instance, students in the Midwest, South, and West reported significantly greater access to politics and government content than students in the Northeast. In contrast, students in the Northwest reported significantly greater access to political debate than students in the Midwest and South. In terms of state testing policy, states that test in social studies subjects tended to provide greater access or opportunity to civics content. However, we observed only negligible differences in access to evidence-based instructional approaches. Moving on to the last slide, I will briefly summarize what we found and discuss implications in response to these results. As in the previous slides, Black and Hispanic students of relatively lower SES, and students with disability generally reported greater opportunity than their counterparts. These findings were surprising given the prior evidence to the contrary and the continued test score gaps that Grady and Ebony explained. Also, the city-suburban differences and city-rural differences are worth highlighting. Especially, lower levels of access in rural areas should be addressed. To close in this presentation, I would like to highlight further needs for investigation. First, this study provided descriptive evidence for various characteristics separately. Cross-sectoral differences are equally critical and should be further investigated. Next, we need to investigate why reported access to opportunities varies so much within schools. That's an interesting topic to further investigate. Finally, the 2018 NAEP Civics Assessment was administered before COVID-19. The 2022 NAEP Civics will give us critical insight whether similar findings hold true after the onset of COVID-19 pandemic. This is the references, and thank you so much. Feel free to email us if you have any questions.
Thank you, Saki. Maddie?
Okay, let me share my screen. Oops. Give me a second. Sorry. Oops. Sorry for the technology problems. Give me a sec. Zoom should have practiced, right?
No problem.
All right. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Thank you. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to give this presentation. I relish any opportunity to discuss NAEP social science data, and so I'm very happy to be here to do that. I'm going to discuss, my presentation is going to discuss a paper really that was written with colleagues of mine from ETS, Andrew Weiss, Jesse Sparks, and Kelsey Dreyer. And I'm going to do a very high level discussion, extremely high level discussion of the data analysis that we did. Basically because there's just an enormous amount of detail there. The paper is pretty long, and I hope that Jasmine shares a link to that if you haven't already seen it. I'm happy, just as Saki said, to engage in a discussion with folks about the details of that data insofar as I can outside of this presentation or in the discussion portion. But I just want to say at the outset that it's going to be very high level and not very data focused. The last part of my presentation will be a brief discussion of the task development exploration that we did in the paper around how to better measure the historical thinking skills and civic participatory skills in large-scale assessments. I also want to just present my own perspective on this so you understand from which I'm talking to this topic. I have a background in history, and so I come to this discussion with that as a kind of main focus. I've worked for many years in the past, most recent past in NAEP reporting. And I work with Grady and Ebony on reporting results, both for the social science assessments and for some other assessments, anything that flies my way. I also write policy reports for the Center for Human Capital and Education that use large-scale assessment data from both national and international assessments. In addition, I sometimes insert myself or am inserted into work with the social science item development team when we have the opportunity to develop new item types and new items for social science assessments. And finally, I want to just make it clear that I'm speaking today as a researcher at ETS, and the views that I present here, those mine and those of the other authors of the paper, not of ETS itself, nor of NCES or of the governing board that oversees the NAEP assessment. So the questions that we explored in the paper really involved what can the NAEP data that Ebony and Grady presented, that was what we call like the descriptive data, The overall results for the 2018, again, the 2022 assessment results were not available when we began the research on this. So what can the NAEP data tell us about students' knowledge and skills in these two domains, and what the relationship of those are to issues related to equity and opportunity? And secondly, how can we improve the measurement of core skills associated with these two domains? So the approach we took was a regression analysis, and we looked at how a cluster of variables or factors that are captured in the SQs, what we call SQ survey questionnaires or background questionnaires, which are given to students and teachers and schools, how those relate to student performance in NAEP civics and US history. And the factors clustered around these sort of 4 areas, and we had 4 regression models that we ran with the data. One set of factors related to demographic issues, gender, race, English language learning, for example. Another set of factors related to SES, books in the home, parental education, National School Lunch Program eligibility. And again, the paper itself lists all of the variables that we included in each of the models and all the data related to it, both in the body of the paper and in the appendix, if you want to see that. The third model that we used is a collection of factors related to what the literature calls opportunity to learn, specifically teacher background and preparation in these core domains, as well as classroom practices. And finally, we looked at student attitudes, that is their interest and enjoyment of the subject, but also, as I think Ebony mentioned, their confidence in being able to perform skills-related tasks in both of the domains. I'm going to just kind of give you the overall result that we had here. I do have a slide with the results for each of the different models, but I didn't want to take up too much time going through all of that. So either in the question and answer period, I can show that slide, but now I just want to say that all those factors together in the model explained 40% of the variance in student scores. So all of those factors, and they're complicatedly related to each other in terms of access to quality education and opportunities, accounted for 40% of the variance in scores that were shown by Ebony and Grady. So some of the takeaways from that piece of the paper and that portion of the paper was that we need to do more to prepare and support social studies teachers to teach the skills that are associated with civics and US history. We need to explore more nuanced ways of reporting NAEP results to account for issues related to equity and opportunity. And I know that those in the NAEP reporting area at ETS and Ebony and Grady and others in the reporting division at NCES are working hard on various kinds of products that will do that. And lastly, we need to continue to invest in research around what improves learning and measurement in these two areas. And it's that last point that I want to delve into in this second part of the presentation. And what I want to focus on here is how we came up with some proposals for how to better measure the skills components of these two domains. So in both of these domains, there's a knowledge component, and I think most people could agree that large-scale assessments and multiple choice, and either with multiple choice and constructive response, we've learned how to relatively well measure the knowledge component of these domains. What's much harder to measure are the skills components. So in the civic area, the literature and theoretical literature around what constitutes this construct revolve around the knowledge piece, then the civic skills, critical thinking, teamwork, written and oral communication, civic dispositions, such as responsibilities of citizenship, interest in the welfare of others, and capacity to engage in meaningful civic discourse. And finally, civic engagement, which is essentially the integration of knowledge, skills, and dispositions to solve public problems. On the US history side, we have knowledge about US history and US history topics. And then we have historical thinking skills, which more or less fall into these 4 categories, according to the literature. Analyzing sources and evidence that are text and non-text based, making historical connections, that is contextualizing, comparing perspectives, chronological reasoning and dealing with issues of causation, and finally creating and supporting historical arguments. So it's really the red typed issues that we wanted to focus a little more on how we could better measure these in a large scale assessment. So to give you a little bit of an example of one of the tasks that we developed for the paper to explore this, I'm going to just show one and just tell you about the others. This is a task oriented, and again, just to remind you, I'm not sure if it was mentioned before that these are all given digitally at this point, starting in 2018. So the assessment is given online, and that affords us some opportunities to use technology in a way to improve measurement. The source container task is really essentially a way of having students interact with various kinds of sources, both text and non-text. And this particular task was one on Freedom Summer for the summer of 1964. We give students in this first screen a little bit of an introduction to what the task is going to be about and what they're going to see in terms of a collection of documents. The next screen would give students a little bit of background about a film they're going to see, a film clip from a news report from CBS News that was aired on June 25th, 1964, after the civil rights workers were missing, so the 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi. So it gives you a little bit of that background. Then the students are given a film to watch and likely a number of questions that ask them whether they understand the basic content of the film. And then later in the task, they might be given a question like this that asks them, here, the news segment makes which of the following arguments about the Mississippi Summer Project, and they can choose one of these options. And then the second aspect of this task would be to choose a clip from the film that supports their selection. So what we did was have about 1.5 minutes-ish, a little bit less film that we then segmented into 4 parts. And the students could, as they watch the film, click on the part that best represented the argument that they selected above. So that's a kind of a different item type in order to get at their ability to analyze evidence and support arguments. In addition, this little icon about film info could be clicked by the students during the task. And behind the scenes, we would record student actions, and that information too could give us some interesting data about the relationship of students' ability to contextualize and look for contextualizing information before, after, during engaging with this particular task or question. I also want to just mention that that same kind of capability of choosing parts or what parts of sources support what kinds of arguments or claims is something that we can do with also text-based sources. So here in this particular question, the students were shown a film, then they were in this whole task, they were shown or listened to a radio broadcast, and then they were shown a document. The question here on the right side of the screen was select 2 pieces of evidence from either of the 3 documents that support the following claim. And then the claim is below. So here they could click on various paragraphs within a text document, and those would be dragged and dropped into this area over here. Additional tasks that we talk about in the paper that I don't have time, unfortunately, to show you are a timeline task that uses an interactive map charting change over time. This, in this instance, from 1820 to 1990 over the US, a change in transportation systems from canals, railways, and highways, and the impact of this on the growth of cities, urbanization, and population growth overall. And this task, we sort of go through a number of questions in that task, and it allows us to measure students' chronological reasoning and ability to grapple with issues around causation. Also, we have a task, a web search task, which is kind of very closely related to the civics skill of measuring students' literacy skills. And that kind of task can engage students and allow us to collect data on students' ability to efficiently and accurately do web searches and then select the most meaningful websites to provide information about a particular topic that we give them. And finally, another proposal was to have a simulated conversation in a digital environment where students would engage with an avatar or a virtual assistant, and that would allow us to measure issues of collaboration and engagement to solve a problem. So to kind of summarize and open this up for questions for the audience that and for us to think about around this, I think the main kind of driving questions of the paper and the research was, how do we better assess students' historical thinking skills and participatory skills in this large scale environment? And why is this important? I think that really is the underlying kind of piece to what I've been talking about, what Saki talked about, and what Grady and Ebony spoke about. How do we use the data that NAEP collects to better inform learning and educational policy, and the fact that that data is only as meaningful as our ability to measure well the construct under consideration. It's really my and the author's understanding really that we can always do better, and I think we can push more in terms of understanding how to measure the historical thinking skills and participatory skills that are embedded in these domains. And I think that goes for not just large scale assessments, but formative and summative assessments in this area as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Maddie. Erin, you are next.
Hi, I'm Erin Adams. I'm from the Social Studies Research SIG. I'm the chair and very happy to be here. I teach elementary social studies methods primarily at Kennesaw State University. So everything that has been said has been really resonant with me. So I'm not necessarily going to do a presentation. I just want to thank the presenters for inviting our SIG to be here today and for sharing this information. I'll admit that I don't know as much about NAEP as I would like to, and it's been really informative to read the documents that you all shared to learn more about how these tests and assessments are created. And I was really interested in the use of technology in how we can assess not just content knowledge but skills. And I'm personally a big believer in developing those historical thinking skills and those what we call disciplinary reasoning skills. So I have questions that I'm curious to ask some of the presenters, but I know there's probably questions from the audience. So yeah, I'm just really excited about this research. I want to think about what we do with these findings and conclusions, and then thinking about like Saki's work. How do we think about these variations in what we think outcomes are going to be related to students' achievement, how that might vary within schools, and who has opportunities for civic learning, and what does that look like? And I'm really interested in thinking about how we open up this idea about what it means to know civics and to do civics. I think that's a really relevant debate that we should always be thinking about. So thank you so much for letting me be part of this.
Thank you, Erin, for joining us. And Laura, I'll turn it over to you. And we should have a few minutes for questions and answers and discussion. So please submit your questions if you haven't.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jasmine, and everybody. This was a great set of presentations. I certainly learned a lot and found it really thought-provoking. And I will just share a few really quick remarks because I want to make sure we have time for questions and discussion. I think the main takeaway from this session is that if we weren't already aware of it before, it just really highlights the value and importance of NAEP as a critical national resource for us. And I love that the focus in this one was on civics and history. I think we've talked a lot over the last few years, especially about the impacts of COVID-19 and school closures on math and reading scores, and there are good reasons for focusing on those. But, you know, I think it's important for us not to lose sight of the many other ways in which schools contribute to young people's readiness to engage effectively in their communities and their families, in the workplace, and in education. And so these findings that were shared today are really concerning and also very important for helping us understand what some of the problems are, and then using that information to devise a solution. I also really appreciated the emphasis on the school questionnaires, because, you know, again, the test scores get a lot of attention every time they come out. I don't think we talk enough about what we're learning from these school questionnaires, which are really wonderful data sources on young people's opportunity to learn in the area of civics and history. I think that, you know, a related takeaway is that NAEP is valuable, but you know, we're also hearing about where there are some gaps in the kind of data that NAEP is able to provide, which really opens up opportunities for us to think about, you know, innovative item development, like what Maddie and her colleagues at ETS have been exploring. You know, thinking more about how we can gather more detailed opportunity to learn data than is possible in a large kind of survey project like NAEP. And so I'm really happy that we've got the two AER SIGs collaborating on this session, and seeing the names of the folks who are here, who, you know, bring just a lot of really valuable research and development expertise. I think that, you know, moving this forward is going to just take a lot of collaboration and really draw on everybody's best thinking. So it's nice to see so many people who are invested in this area. So those are just some super quick reactions. And then I hope, let's see, there's no questions in the Q&A yet. So if you start populating that, we'll try to get to as many as we can. Let me start with a question, and this can be answered by any of the panelists. So I'm thinking about, you know, my earlier point about we've paid a lot of attention to math and reading. That's partly because they're, you know, we have more data on them. They're sort of the core state accountability subjects. But what can we do to kind of help the public, policymakers, funders, others understand the importance of looking at civics and history and providing those resources that our young people and our teachers need? So I'm just curious to hear what others in this meeting think about that. Yeah, Ebony.
I don't have a direct answer to your question, just a reflection that it wasn't long ago when the push for more civic engagement and education was really high and making it up to the levels of Congress. It wasn't that long ago. And then things changed. I don't want to talk about why, I don't know why, but I guess I'm just reflecting that that fire to want to educate students on American democracy, on history, on these important content areas isn't dead. It has its flare-ups, and my hope is that 2030 is the next time, well, we'll have a new framework in these content areas for NAEP. And we're also planning to have state level results, I believe, for civics. So I'm hoping in, you know, building up to those activities, there will be, you know, more interest. I'm just saying in this short span of time, I've seen it flip-flop.
Yeah, those are really great observations, Ebony, and that's a nice reminder of the future planned expansions and changes to NAEP, which I think will be incredibly valuable. The other thing, and I'm interested in hearing from other folks too, you know, we're hearing from a lot of teachers in particular that some of the politicization of these topics has, you know, made them afraid to talk about them or afraid to bring up certain topics. And I think that's another factor, unclear to what extent that's actually, you know, leading to changes in student learning, but it seems like it almost inevitably will if teachers continue to feel this pressure to, you know, sort of so closely monitor what they say in the classroom.
Yeah, I think you're pointing out, Laura, a really critical problem with the issue of the content of the assessment and the relationship of that content to the skills piece. And I think leaning, not that we cannot have the content, we absolutely have to have the content. But I do think that leaning on the skills piece, because there's kind of a contradiction in my mind in popular discussion about what students need to know and do. We always hear that students need more critical thinking skills. They need to be able to problem solve. Well, these are the disciplines where you really learn how to do this, among others. It's not solely this. But if we can kind of push a little bit more on the ability of these domains to really help students develop the very skills they're going to need to be successful, the growth of AI, I think, even makes that even more critical. So there's kind of an opportunity here in a way, but it's not an easy one to grasp.
Yeah, I think that's what I appreciated a lot in your work, Maddie, was sort of this. It's when we think teaching history, like when I talk to my students about that, we have 17 here in the state of Georgia, 17 information processing skills that are supposed to, that's how you access the content. So it's not just like, repeating information. That's what my students often think. That's how they learn social studies. That's how they were taught. That's what they think it is.
Right.
Memorizing content and not those skills. And it's a paradigm shift when I'm trying to teach them.
Yeah.
And it's reminding me of studies in social studies back like during the Cold War. We really got this push for this disciplinary thinking because it was seen as a sort of, at a time when there was a lot of ideological push, right, as a way of sort of being a buffer against that and saying like, we're teaching skills. We're not teaching kids to what to think, we're teaching them how to think.
Mm-hmm.
And even that even that you would think would be sort of value neutral. And it's still open. People get upset about that. So I think about all the misunderstanding and the contentiousness about what it means to teach and learn civics and history. So I think, it's really important work. I think getting out there what y'all are actually doing and what you're actually measuring and testing is really important.
Yeah.
So Erin, you had said you had questions, so there's still nothing in the Q&A that I'm seeing. So
I guess just one question. I was curious about. So I know the results that were shared today were from the 2018 assessments, and then kind of looking forward, I think, into what some of the test questions are being developed. I was kind of curious about, like, I don't know, maybe this is a bad question. How have test questions, the construction of the test questions, changed over time? Is there, when we're looking at like decline in test scores, is there something to be attributed to the sort of the change in structure or a shift towards skills versus content? I'm just, kind of curious when we think about like interpretation of those numbers.
I can try to answer that question, but Ebony or Grady, do you want to prefer to answer it?
You start. I was doing something else. Go ahead.
Grady?
No, go ahead, Maddie.
Okay. I think, in general, the assessments really have not been, we haven't done any new development for a while. These were re-administered assessments at grade 8 from 2014 and then 2018. There were some new blocks added in 2018, but then they're all sort of psychometrically analyzed to be, we're filling holes in the content that were left by the others, so they need to kind of be very specifically written to the framework that was developed. The framework for history was developed around 1994, and the framework for civics around 1997. So those frameworks did talk about those skills that I mentioned. Those historical thinking skills were actually embedded there, and we do have questions that measure skills and knowledge. So the frameworks that you saw or that were given to you will represent that. But there hasn't been a change in the type of content they would have to, in order for us to report trend over time, we have to remain sort of consistent to to how we measure the construct. Grady, do you want to add more intelligence to that response?
All the intelligence that was necessary, you put in there, so good to go. Nothing to add.
Okay.
Oh, and sorry, do you all do any sort of like professional development with teachers or educators? I'm sort of thinking about like how even as students would prepare for a test like this. You know, is there anything that you all do, or are you just sort of doing the assessments?
I'll go, and then if anyone has anything to add, please let me know. We don't do any personal professional development with the teachers, and we don't want the students to necessarily prepare for the assessment. Like Maddie was talking about, the framework is a group of people who are experts in a particular subject. They come together and they say, this is what we think 8th graders should know about civics and U.S. history. And then we just come and assess it and seeing what they know. So we don't want them preparing. We don't do professional development with teachers. We have a litany of questions that we ask teachers in schools and students that I think could be useful for those who are doing professional development with educators and those interested in these two subjects. But NCS as an organization, we don't do professional development with school staff.
We do provide participants tutorials and sample questions, though. We do want them to get at least acclimated with how we assess. And we also have the NAEP questions tool where anyone can see released items. And we actually do encourage just stakeholders, you know, not necessarily participating in NAEP, just to kind of engage in the content, you know, create your own tests, send that to your own group of students. So we do encourage broadly people to kind of understand what we assess and how we assess.
Yeah, and there is a bigger point, and I think Maddie mentioned this, that teachers, and we've seen this from other survey data, that teachers across the country often say large majorities of them say they didn't get adequately prepared to teach these subjects in either their pre-service preparation program or their ongoing professional development. So there is a clear need beyond just the NAEP test. There's a clear need for better professional learning opportunities for teachers in this area.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that and just underscore that the purpose of the test is not to blame the students for not knowing something or to blame the teachers for not teaching something, but it's clear that the teachers can't, it's hard to teach these skills. They're really difficult skills. And it's not easy to teach them if you haven't been taught how to teach them. So I think this is a problem, sort of, that's the educational policy piece of this that we need to sort of really be looking at.
Yeah. And
yes, that was another question, right?
Yeah.
What do we do with this data and with these findings?
Yeah. I was just going to add the instructional materials are also critical, and that's another area where a lot of teachers are, say they could use more support. Okay, well, we're just a little bit past the top of the hour, and there aren't any questions in the Q&A box. So I'm sure everybody has meetings and other obligations to get back to, but thank you all for this really, really wonderful set of presentations, and I hope this session today generates more discussion and interest in both NAEP and in improving young people's civics and history learning opportunities.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone again for joining us today. And like I mentioned earlier, the link will become available shortly after we are done today, and you'll get a link and also the resources that's been shared in the chat today. Have a wonderful holiday season and goodbye.
Bye. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.